Guys, welcome back to our Gray Hack series. We're going to get a little bit more into the scripting side of it today. We're going to go through the basics just to, if you guys haven't learned anything about it, this is going to be the place to start. Again, if you haven't subscribed, subscribe on our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitch, and let's get into it here. I know we're probably sick of buying all of the exploits from the exploit shop every single time. Not only does it cost money, but it clogs up your inventory. So we're going to go to a code editor here, and we're just going to start from scratch. We're going to just build our own program. We're going to learn some of the basic commands. What we're going to have to do first is usually we're going to have to load in our meta exploit library, as well as we're going to have to get an IP address. We're going to have to get a port number, and we're going to have to gather some information with that IP and port. So including your meta exploit library is pretty simple. We can just give a variable name for it. So let's go meta x equals. This variable can be whatever you want. I just usually keep it simple and relevant to exactly what we're doing. And then we can use a Gray script code called include library. And once you type in the different functions here, it tells you up top here how it's used. So include library, and it wants a string to the library path. So we'll enclose it in brackets. So we're going to put our library path, which is usually library meta exploit.so. Again, this is just the very basic way of doing it. We can have it return different paths in case it's in the same path as your program and whatever, but we're going to start very simple. We're going to learn include library, path your meta exploit library, and it's going to take the result from this. It's going to include that library into the variable meta_x. And that's as simple as that part is. Next step, what we're going to do, we want to be able to get an IP address, and we want to be able to get a port number. So in order to get an IP address, we're going to look at getting user input, because we don't want to always have to hard code the IP and the port number into the program. So I think this is a great time to look at getting user input. And again, we're going to properly lay this out at the functions and a little bit more advanced later on. But for right now, we're just going to look at a few of the different, very simple elements that you can use inside of your script. So we need to get an IP address. So again, we're going to set a variable IP address. No need to complicate it. Just make it something that's relevant to what you're using. So IP address equals. Now we want to ask the user, what IP address do you want to use? So for this case, we're going to go user input. And you see it turns blue, and it's something that the script recognizes. It's a built-in function. User input. And it wants a string for an input message. And then other options you can do is if it's a password and key, we're not going to use that. We're just going to use the input message, and we're going to tell them in a string. So strings are enclosed in quotation marks. Please enter an IP. So what we're going to do, I'm going to save this, and we're going to run it every step of the way. This multi-tool. So it's going to turn into a multi-tool as we keep going. I'll save this as the infinity.source. So once it's saved, you cannot run it because it's a source file. You need to hit this play button, build code, and save binary program. So this will compile it. We'll do it in tutorials again. We'll call it multi-in infinity. Save. So now once the user, it's going to say please enter IP, the user is going to enter the IP and it's going to store it into the variable. So let's check that. Let's always do a print the IP you entered is, and then to add on to this, we're going to do this in IP address. Now the reason I don't put this in quotes is because it's not a string. Here we're calling the variable. So once it's not in quotes, it knows that it's the variable and it's going to display the contents of the variable. Now this right here, because there's no space, it's going to add it right to the end. So usually you put a space and then it's going to butt this right up to where you left off here. That way, otherwise there wouldn't be a space between is and the variable. So all we're doing right now is we're getting the user input. We're asking what IP address you want, and then it's going to just show you that the IP address you entered is this. Let's build that, save it, and run it. Multitool. You can type ls again to see what's in it. Multitool infinity. We're going to just run it. Multitool infinity. Okay, you can see here, please enter IP address. Let's go 24.67.82.12. A few other random numbers I made up just for showing. And the IP you entered is that because it saves this in its memory into the variable. All right, we can do 2 forward slashes. That comments that out. So now that we have an IP address, we also need to get a port. So we are going to make another variable, which at this point, probably we could call it port. And we know how to do this already. User input. We'll do port equals user input. Oh, please enter a port. All that, save it, run it. It's going to pause in between now. You see it says please enter an IP address. IP address. Now it says please enter a port. There you go. We will run some checks later on to check to make sure it is a valid IP, to make sure it is a proper port. But again, for this tutorial's sake, this is just the very basics and getting familiar with the script a little bit. So we're going to cover the very basics, and then in future tutorials, we're going to use it, we're going to build on it, we're going to add checks, we're going to turn them into functions, we're going to start forming this into a full multi-tool that can be used. Now that we have an IP address and a port number, we need to find out what exactly is running on this IP and port. So what libraries are running on that port number and what versions are running on it, because that's going to make a difference for what exploit we're going to be using. So in order to find that, we can use we can create what's called a net session, which is going to use a command called net use. So you know what, let's keep this simple. We'll create a net session object and we will use net use. And you can see up top here, it wants an IP address and a port number. And this is also going to want to know your meta exploit library to use. So we can do a net use. We can put in our meta exploit library, which is now saved in the variable metax. Then it wants our IP address, which we've saved into IP address. And then it wants your port, which we've saved into port. Now, if I turn around and I print, let's just try this, net session, save that, compile it, everything run okay so far. Now I try to run this. We're going to go We're going to put that IP, we're going to run 22, and we get something back called null. So what null is means that there's nothing there. So it's printing this net session, but in that session there's nothing for some reason. So what it's asking for here is port. It wants this to be an integer or a number. And we have port coming in as a string. So what we need to do, we need to cast this, it's called in programming, cast this string and tell the program that we don't want this to be a string, we want this to be an integer. So in order to cast that, we're going to call it isInt. Now it's letting this know that this variable is an integer. So let's try to run that again. IP, I2. Oh, is it not isInt? No, what? toInt. Every language is a little bit different. So toInt, it's going to convert it to integer. Run that, run that. All right, now it returns net session. So this net session is a net session object. So this not only is the word net session, but this has stuff stored into it. And for testing purposes, just to show you what's on it, we can do a dot underscore underscore isa. Save that, we'll run it, and we will redo that, and 22. So now it shows here different things that you can do with this net session. Dump library, get number of users, get numbers port forward, get number connect gateway, is any active user, is root active user. So these are some different things you can use to see. So for what we want to do, we want to dump the library. So what we're going to do in that case now is we're going to create another variable that we're going to dump it into. We'll call it metalib equals dump lib net session. And you know what? Let's change this variable now to metalib. Save it, compile it, run it. All right, we now have an object called metalib. And again, we can do the same thing we did before. Save, compile. Now it shows us different functions we can use with the metalib. So there's overflow, library name, version. So there's two that we're looking for right here. We're looking for the library name and we're looking for the version. So what we can do now is, why don't we switch this with knowing that, and why don't we do library name metalib plus, we'll add a space in between. We just add a string with one space character in between. That way, between these two variables that we're putting, it's going to leave a space. And then we can do version of metalib. There's always something you overlook pretty easily. So now let's run that. We'll run that for 22. So now that we can see on here, this is running library ssh.so at version 1.0. So again, this is single player. For right now, I'm just starting. Everything's going to be version 1.0. But on multiplayer, you're going to get all kinds of different versions. So that's a good start. But we could take this a little bit of a step further now. We want to know, okay, not just what one port. We want to be able to maybe, let's put in an IP, see what all ports are on that, and get all of the library and versions that are running off of that IP. So this is a good time to take this a little bit step further. What we're going to do now is we are going to need to get the router object. So this is the next step we'll be doing. We comment out this get port because we're not going to be asking the user for a port anymore. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be getting the router object and seeing what ports are. So let's start off with that. Let's first go router equals, we'll set a variable for router object as router, and then we'll use a built-in function called getRouter, and we'll pass in there the IP address that we get. Then we can do a print router, and since it's an object, we can go is save that. Now we are going to get some errors down here because we're not using this port variable any longer. But for now, we're just going to focus on what this is showing us, and then we'll get that fixed. So if we put our IP, it's not going to ask us for the port anymore. But here's the error that we're getting because this port is not being brought in here anymore. But that's not what we're worried about. We're going to look at the router object right now. So in the router object, you can see all kinds of different functions that you can do with it. And if you look, there's one here called used ports on that router. So why don't we try doing this? Let's go print. We can go ports is equal to used ports router. Now if we print ports, save that, we're going to see if we have any port objects saved into ports. Let's run that, and you can see we have port and port. So there is two different ports that are in that are being used. Now these again are not the number variable, so it's not going to show you what number is yet. These are objects that we now have to take a little bit further. So we want to know in this list, so if it has the square brackets, this is a list. So it has multiple parts to it. We want to go through this list and take for each one of these and find out what number exactly this is. So this is where we're going to have to get into something that's called a for loop. So we want to iterate over this list. So we're going to say for port in ports. This again is just a variable. I usually use the singular of a plural in a list. It just keeps things simple if you can. So for port in ports, what we want to do is now we can go print, and then there's another function called, we can go port dot port number, and we can end for. So what it's going to do, so for every port in this list, it's going to take that, the first one, print the port number, and then it's going to loop back through, take the second one, print the port number, and then when it's done, the for loop is going to end and we're going to exit. We don't need print ports here anymore. So this should very basically look at the router from the IP that we're getting, see what ports are being used, and then iterate over the list and print each of the port numbers. So let us save that, compile it, replace, and there we go. We can see that this IP address is using port 22 and it's using port 25. Now, we want to combine that with what we did down here to get the library and the version number. So we're going to take net session and put in. So for port and ports, it's going to create the net session, and this toInt port is now going to just be called port dot port number, because we wanted to replace it with the port number there. We don't want to put the port object there, otherwise you're going to get a null net session. So we're going to return this as port number. And then we're going to take our metalib, we're going to dump it. Now we're going to put our print statement, but we're also going to include the port number. So port dot port number. So space plus the library name plus the space plus the version. So now what this should do is this should get the IP address, get all the router object that's associated with that IP address, find what ports are being used on that router object, and then iterate through the list to create a net session. It's going to dump that library, and then it's going to print the port number, library name, and the version. Line 9 doesn't like something. Like, so not like awesome. Thanks for the follow. Yeah, right. Sometimes staring at it so long you can miss the smallest thing. Yeah. Perfect. Staring at all day can make you crazy, especially when it when it gets to be 800,000, 2,000 lines. One little comment could throw you right off. All right, so that takes it from having the user having to enter the port and then pulling the ports off of the router. Now to take this another step further, we want to only do this on ports that are open and not ports that are closed. So in our port if statement, we can use another function called isClosed. So we can do another if port.isClosed, then we can print port number plus isClosed. And yeah. So we're open. Let's just see if we can find something else. Okay, perfect, right there. So now we can see on this IP we have a SQL port, but it's closed, so it did not continue to do through the rest of the script. It just continued on to the next one, which was not closed, and it ran it through the rest of the script. For part one, that's basically going to wrap this up. We're going to end up turning this into different functions and going a little bit more advanced to it, but this can just show you how you can get different information, and now we're able to see what port, what library, and what versions are running off of this. And then what we'll be able to do with this information is now take this and be able to see what exploits are available on these open ports and libraries, instead of having to go to our laptop every single time and search and buy and get new scripts. We'll be able to eventually implement a multi-tool that can do different things on these ports. People find mean like here, like if I want to do Is it on? Sometimes I just forget that I can talk. I see the chat typing, so I type. There you go. Does that make you happier now? There you go. Yeah, you can't tab everything over, LT. Like if you're, at least there's not a way that I know how to. I usually do it in in Visual Studio and copy it over, but just for the sake of these little tutorial videos, I just do it right in the editor so everybody can see. Pain in the butt, but so that's because they do have a grayscript plugin for Visual Studio. You've been playing the Greyhawk for a while, or what? Well, with that done, I'm gonna jump off and grab some dinner. I don't know if you're still here. You got a Discord or something? Wouldn't mind talking with more people who play this game. It seems to be a pretty select community.